The gavel came down before the boy could finish drawing breath. That is how I remember it, not the vote tally, not the formal reading of charges, not the ceremonial lighting of the conclave's 12 amber columns that tradition required. Before any sanction of consequence, I remember the gavel, a rod of pale mineral, carved from the bones of some world I had never visited, swung by a presiding elder whose title translated roughly as the mouth of accumulated grievance. I remember the sound, a flat hard report against the obsidian block, and then the silence that followed, a silence the conclave seemed to inhale and hold as though they had been waiting their whole careers for exactly this moment. And I remember the boy, his name was Davin Merce, 18 years old by our calendar, 22 by hegemonic reckoning, which the conclave used for all official documentation because they had never bothered to adopt ours. He had been attached to our delegation for 11 months as a courier and secondary records clerk, the kind of posting that was supposed to be a career foundation, a way for a young officer to watch seasoned diplomats work and learn the grain of interstellar negotiation before taking on anything of weight. He was from a mid-continent city on one of our older settled worlds, one of 6 children, with a mother who sent him condensed audio letters that he played back each morning before the session opened. I know this because I sat beside him for nearly a year. I know the specific way he arranged his data slates before a meeting, flush to the left edge of the desk, 3 of them in ascending order of current relevance. I know that he took notes the old way by hand in a small bound ledger because he said it forced him to be selective about what he recorded and selective about what you record forces you to understand what actually matters. He was in the quiet opinion of everyone in our delegation going to be extraordinary. The KTH summit had been running for nearly a year when the 47th day arrived. A year of sessions in the hegemonic conclave's grand chamber, a hall built of dark veined stone and polished transit alloy with tiered seating that rose in curved rows to vatted ceiling. The 12 amber columns spaced evenly around the perimeter and lit its session, opened by attendants in ceremonial robes. The chamber seated 400 comfortably. On session days, it often held 600. Sound inside it was particular, the specific quality of a large enclosed space designed to make a speaker sound authoritative, to amplify the voice of whoever held the floor and absorb the noise of everyone else into a kind of weighted murmur. 47 delegations had spent 11 months in that room building a framework treaty that was supposed to govern trade, transit, and dispute resolution across a sector of space containing 63 inhabited systems. It was the most significant piece of interstellar architecture attempted in 2 generations, and it had been going reasonably well, not smoothly. Nothing like this goes smoothly, but productively in the way that difficult work among parties with genuinely competing interests can be productive when each party is willing to engage seriously with what the other needs. We had built half of it, our signatures on the final document would make the other half enforceable. The hegemonic conclave knew this, we knew they knew it. The knowledge was in a certain sense the foundation of the whole enterprise. The reason we had been at the table for 11 months was that both sides understood the product would be worth more with both signatures than with one. The 47th day was supposed to be a procedural Session: a housekeeping vote on the session calendar for the following quarter, a clarification of 2 subsection definitions, and a review of the transit corridor mapping that hour. Technical teams had submitted the previous week, nothing of substance. The kind of session where junior officers were often more attentive than seniors, because the procedural details mattered, and the senior delegates were often managing correspondence in parallel. Devon was attentive. He was always attentive on procedural days because he understood in the way the best junior officers understand things before they can fully articulate them, that the procedural sessions were where the substance was actually built, the definitions that got clarified, the calendar rhythms that got established, the mapping language that got accepted. These were the hidden load-bearing elements of whatever the major sessions decided. He had said this to me once, about 3 months into the summit, standing in the corridor during a break and looking back through the chamber doors at the conclave senior delegates arranging themselves for the next vote. He said it quietly, not showing off. Way you say something when you are still working out whether you believe it. I told him he was right. He went back to his desk and wrote it down in his ledger. The 47th day's procedural session was 40 minutes old when the administrative officer's aide came to our table and whispered in Petravale's ear. Petra listened, nodded, and gestured to Devon. She said a few words to him, low and clear. He picked up the message she indicated, stood and crossed toward the administrative officer's desk on the far side of the chamber floor. As he had been asked to do, he was halfway across when the presiding elder raised the gavel. I think in the first second that most of our delegation assumed the gavel was for something else, a point of order, a wayward delegate in the upper tiers, the ordinary administrative business a presiding elder manages with a tap of the gavel in any given session. I looked up from the subsection review I was reading and saw Devon on the floor, 3/4 of the way to the administrative officer's desk, and saw the gavel raised, and felt something shift in the temperature of the room, the way temperature shifts before a storm. The conclave senior delegates had turned their attention toward the floor, not toward Devon specifically, toward the floor, toward the space he occupied, the way an audience turns its attention when something has been arranged for them to watch. Petra rose immediately. Senior Delegate Vale requests the floor to address the charge. The mouth of accumulated grievance looked at her for 3 full seconds, then it looked away. The floor is not available during correction proceedings. The crossing was at the request of correction proceedings. Do not accommodate external testimony. The right has been invoked. The gavel came up. Let the record show the violation is established, Petra said very quietly. This is a mistake. The gavel came down. There is a phrase in hegemonic legal tradition I had studied it as background reading when we arrived, the way you study everything and retain whatever might become useful. The phrase translates as the weight of correction falls on the transgressor alone. It is meant to convey that a punitive sanction touches only the individual named, not their delegation, not their sovereign body, not their home world. It is a legal boundary meant to prevent disputes from metastasizing. In practice, what it meant was that what happened next happened only to Davenmore, and the conclave considered the matter fully contained by that boundary. What they did to him took 11 minutes. I will not describe it in detail, not because I'm protecting anyone's sensibility. Anyone reading this account will find the documentation if they wish, but because the details are not the point. And I have learned over the years that dwelling in the specific texture of cruelty serves the cruelty's purpose more than it serves the accounting of it. What I will say is that the hegemonic right of necessary correction had not been used against a living being in 400 years. What I will say is that those 11 minutes were conducted in absolute procedural order. Every step called by its formal name in the old hegemonic tongue, every attending official in their prescribed position, the amber columns burning at their traditional height, and that when it was over, the presiding elder set the gavel down with the unhurried care of someone completing a routine clerical task, and then said in our language, so there would be no confusion, corrections of this gravity serve as counsel to all parties present. The conclave trusts the lesson has been received. Then the elder looked at Petrovale and waited. Whole chamber waited. 47 delegations, observers in the gallery, the transmission arrays, the weight of the hegemonic conclave and everything it represented. 700 years of established interstellar order, 42 member species, legal and military architecture so deeply grooved into the galaxy's infrastructure that most of the species present could not conceive of a political reality that did not have it at its center. All of that weight aimed at one woman sitting at a rectangular table in the third row, waiting for her to absorb the lesson. Petrovale was 63 years old. She had spent 31 of those years in service to the Terran sovereign compact's diplomatic corps, and she had been in worse rooms than this one. Though not by much, she had gray at her temples and a vertical scar along her left jawline from an incident during the cauldron border talks that had gone physical in the final session. And she wore the compact's formal diplomatic coat, dark charcoal, silver piping, the rank bar at the collar with the easy posture of someone who had put it on so many thousands of times it no longer felt like a uniform. She had been sitting perfectly still through the 11 minutes. She had not looked away. Now she reached into her document case, took out a single folded sheet of formal correspondence and placed it on the table in front of her. She did not stand. She did not raise her voice. She did not unfold the document or offer it to anyone. She gathered her slates, her ledger and her case, stood and walked out of the chamber. Our entire delegation followed her, 12 people, moving in silence, chairs set back, footsteps on the stone floor, through the great doors and gone. I was the last. Through the door, I did not look back. Behind me, after a moment's silence so complete, I could hear the ambient hum of the transmission arrays from the gallery above. The conclave erupted in sound. The document Petra left on the table was our formal notification of suspension of negotiations. It had been drafted 3 days prior. She had been carrying it in her case since the morning of the 44th day after our intelligence section had reported the first signs that the conclave was considering a demonstration of authority targeting our delegation. She had not told me she had it prepared. She had told no one except the 2 people who needed to know. That was Petrovale's way. She prepared for outcomes she hoped would not occur, and she said nothing about them until they were relevant. Because the preparation was not pessimism, it was professionalism, and professionalism did not require an audience. The suspension notification ran to 4 paragraphs. Paragraph 1 stated the compact was suspending its participation in the KTH summit, immediately pending review. Paragraph 2 identified the right of necessary correction applied to Courier Dave Merce as the precipitating event, Opera. Paragraph 3 stated that the compact was withdrawing its endorsement of the summit's draft framework, which we had spent 11 months co-authoring. Paragraph 4 was a single sentence. It read, "The compact will be in contact when it determines contact is appropriate." That was all. No demands, no conditions, no threats, no scheduled resumption date. We simply stopped the hegemonic conclave in the 72 hours that followed, sent 9 formal communiques to our delegations receiving address at the Summit Housing Compound. Petra read each one, had them acknowledged at the administrative level to confirm receipt, and did not respond to any of them substantively. When the conclave's protocol secretary came to the compound in person on the second day and requested an audience, the duty officer at our door told him politely that the delegation was not available and would reach out when it was ready to do so. The protocol secretary left a written appeal at the door. It was 4 pages, and the substance of it was that the conclave considered the matter closed, that the right had been lawfully administered, and that a return to negotiations was in everyone's interest. It included language expressing confidence that the compact would recognize the value of the existing relationship. Petra read it once, said it in the administrative folder with the other 8 communiques, and did not respond. On the 3rd day, the conclave issued a public statement describing Davin Mercy's death as a procedural conclusion to a clear violation, and noting that the relevant action was proportionate under established hegemonic legal precedent, and further stating that it expected the Terran Sovereign Compact to recognize its representatives' role in precipitating the corrective action and return to the summit table. Petra read that one twice, then she set it down, went to the window of the compound's common room. It looked out over the summit city, the thin blue towers of the administrative district, the wide transit lanes threading between them, the whole ordered hegemonic machinery of a civilization that had been arranging the galaxy to its liking for 7 centuries and stood there for perhaps 2 minutes without speaking. Then she turned and said, "Get me a direct line to the Secretary of Compact Affairs, not through the hegemonic relay, our own." It took 4 hours to establish because our relay infrastructure in this sector was limited and the routing required bouncing through 3 relay nodes we maintained for exactly this kind of contingency. I sat in the communications room while the technician worked. Petra sat at the table across from me, writing by hand in a small bound ledger, the same habit Davin had used. I noticed, and I did not say so. When the line was established, she picked up the handset, verified the encryption, and spoke for 8 minutes. I was present for that conversation, and I will not reproduce it here in full because parts of it involved operational details that remain classified even now. What I will say is that when she was finished, she set the handset down very carefully and said to me, "We won't be going back to the table ever." I asked, "Not to this one, not to any table they set." I had worked under Petrovale for 9 years. I had seen her negotiate a bilateral extraction treaty with 3 species simultaneously, manage a delegation crisis when one of our senior envoys had a catastrophic medical event in the middle of a session and hold a 3-day silence strategy at the Morath conference that the other party had been convinced was a stalling tactic right up until the moment they realized it was a conclusion. I had never once heard her say something she did not mean. We left the summit city on the 7th day following Davin's death, not in the quiet, careful way of a delegation that might return. We left the way you leave a place you are finished with. Systematic, complete, nothing left behind that you valued. Petra arranged for Davon's remains to be received by the compact consulate on the nearest neutral territory station and entities, and she arranged it through the consulate's own channels, not through the hegemonic administrative office, because she would not ask the hegemonic administration for anything. On the day we departed, she sent a single-line acknowledgement to the conclave's protocol secretariat. The delegation of the Terran sovereign compact has concluded its residency at the KTH Summit facility and is departing. As of this date, no indication of where we were going, no indication of what came next. I know what was said in the conclave in the weeks that followed, because the transmission record is public and the commentary from member delegations was extensive. The prevailing reading among the hegemonic senior assembly was that humanity had reacted emotionally to a lawful corrective action and would, after a period of face-saving withdrawal, return to negotiate because the draft framework was in our economic interests, and we could not afford to abandon it. This view was expressed by several senior hegemonic delegates in chamber commentary that was recorded and archived. One of them used the specific phrase, the tantrum of a species not yet accustomed to the weight of civilized law. Another described the Compact Act suspension as a negotiating posture, not a position, and predicted we would be back at the table within 90 days. Another, a senior delegate from one of the hegemonic client species whose name I will not include here, stated that the right had been precisely calibrated not to destroy the delegation's will, but to locate it so that future negotiations could proceed from a correct understanding of the relationship. I have thought about that phrase many times since. Locate the will, find the edges of what the other party will endure, map it, use the map. What that delegate in the conclave and every subscribing member of the hegemonic order did not know, what they could not have known because they had not asked, because it had never occurred to them to ask, was that the Terran sovereign compact had been operating under a quiet contingency for the previous 4 years. It had not been a secret. It had been published, technically buried in the compact's infrastructure development reports in language sufficiently dry and procedural that no one in the hegemon monitoring apparatus had flagged it as strategically relevant. The reports described an ongoing program of what the compact called sovereign infrastructure development, and the development in question was the establishment of a self-sufficient interstellar framework, a network of transit nodes, supply depots, communication relays, and administrative stations that existed entirely outside the hegemonic routing infrastructure, parallel infrastructure, built quietly over 4 years at considerable expense because someone in Compact strategic planning had looked at the hegemonic order and asked a question that turned out to be worth asking: what would we do if we needed to function without them? They had answered that question before it became urgent. When Petra walked out of the KTH chamber, humanity had a road that didn't run through hegemonic territory. The conclave learned this over the following weeks as they realized that our failure to return to the summit table was not a negotiating posture, it was a notification. The draft framework we had spent 11 months building with them was finished the way something is finished when the party that built half of it declines to sign it. Without compact endorsement, the framework had no access to our transit corridors, our relay network, our trade licensing infrastructure, or the 17 independent species whose trading relationships ran primarily through compact administered channels. The framework was without us. A document describing an order that did not exist. The first sign the conclave registered that something was wrong was when 3 of those 17 independent species quietly declined to attend the second KTH session. They cited scheduling conflicts, then 2 more cited resource allocation concerns. The conclave's protocol secretariat sent inquiries. The inquiries were answered politely. Nothing in the answers was untrue, but the direction of trade and transit had begun incrementally to shift, not toward hostility with the hegemonic order, not toward any formal alignment, just toward routes and nodes and administrative channels that ran on different infrastructure hours. The transit shift in that first quarter was 4 points. I know that number because I tracked it personally in the record I was building, updating it every time. New routing agreement cleared. 4 points sounds small until you understand what it represented in volume. We were moving millions of tons of commercial freight across 63 inhabited systems, and a 4-point shift meant that millions of tons of freight were finding routes that didn't run through hegemonic administrative nodes, didn't generate hegemonic licensing fees, didn't accumulate in the ledger of the conclave's economic coherence. The shift was legal. Every route change had documentation. Every billing adjustment had a proper authorization chain. We had made certain of that because Contingency 7's operational guidelines specified plain language that I had helped write. This is conducted within every applicable framework, uses no coercion, and generates no legitimate grievance. The goal is not confrontation. The goal is the demonstration that the alternative is viable. The viability was the point. Once the alternative was demonstrably viable, once enough parties had run their freight through the Stitnin and found it worked, found the administrative processing was clean, and the dispute resolution was prompt, and the pricing was honest, the question of whether to stay in the hegemonic system or shift to ours became a question with 2 real answers instead of one. For 100 years, for most of the species in the hegemonic order, there had been only one real answer. The conclave had made certain of that by being indispensable. You stop being indispensable the moment the alternative works. I was not in the room for any of this in real time. I had returned to the compact central administrative world after the departure from Cath, filed my full witness report on the 47th day's proceedings, and been assigned to the Secretary of Compact Affairs staff in an advisory capacity. My role was primarily As a witness who had been present, I was consulted on questions of what had happened, what had been said, what Petra had said and not done, and I participated in the internal review that produced the compact's formal position on the Karath incident. I spent 6 weeks writing that review. It was precise, documented, footnoted, and measured. I used the same approach Devan had used with his ledger. I wrote only what I was certain of, and I was selective about certainty, and that selectivity forced me to understand what actually mattered. When I was done, the Secretary of Compact Affairs read it, sat it down, and said, "You were there for all of it." Yes, the boy. I was at the table. He was quiet for a moment. He was a man of perhaps 70, with the particular kind of stillness that comes from having made a very large number of decisions under pressure and having learned to take his time. And Petra placed the notification. Before she left, she had it prepared. She placed it on the table before she stood up. She said nothing. She said nothing. He nodded once slowly, the way you nod when a fact you suspected has been confirmed. Good, he said, and it was not the word I had expected. So I waited. He explained. If she had said something, they would have built a response around what she said. They would have found a thread to pull, a word to contest, a tone to characterize. She gave them nothing to grip. She gave them a document. A document is a fact. You can't argue with a fact. You can only deal with what it means. He stood and looked out the window. This office, too, had a window looking over an administrative city, and I noticed that he stood the same way Petra had stood, in the same posture, and I thought that this must be something they taught, or something the work teaches you, this way of looking out at the evidence of a civilization and taking its measure without flinching. What's coming is going to be large, he said. You should know that. You wrote the review, so you know the numbers, but knowing the numbers doesn't prepare you for the scale. He was right about that. Conclave made its first significant error 4 months after Karath, when it issued what it called a formal notice of obligation, a document asserting that the Terran Sovereign Compact, as a signatory to the hegemonic framework accords of some 2 centuries prior, was obligated to return to the summit process and complete the negotiation in good faith. The notice cited 17 specific clauses of the old accords. It was a legal instrument carefully prepared, and it was designed to put us in the position of either returning to the table or publicly defecting from the framework accords, which the conclave calculated we could not afford to do, because defection from the accords was, in their reading, tantamount to declaring ourselves outside the established order. Petra had been right. We were not going back to any table they set. Our legal team had been working for 4 months. They responded to the formal notice of obligation with a document that ran to 311 pages. I read all of it. Core argument stripped to its essence was this: the framework accords of 2 centuries prior had contained in a procedural appendix that had never been formally litigated a clause establishing that a signator's obligations under the accords were conditioned on the signator's personnel and representatives being treated in accordance with minimum protection standards set out in the accords. Preamble: the hegemonic right of necessary correction as applied to Courier David Merce violated 4 of those minimum standards. Therefore, our obligations under the accords had been suspended by the conclave's own action. On the 47th day of the KTH summit, the document included as an appendix the full session record of the 47th day. It included the transmission footage. It included the administrative officers' communication log showing that Davin had been sent across the floor at the administrative officer's own request. It included Petrovale's formal notification of suspension timestamped with the fold lines documented, and then at the very end in a section titled "For the Record," it included a brief biography of Davenmer, his home world, his family, his record of service, his letters home, the notation in his personnel file from his supervising officer at the summit, that he was, in the supervisor's words, an exceptional young officer with unusual instincts for the work. That last section was not legally necessary. Our legal team had included it anyway. I asked later which lawyer had written that section. I was told it had been Petra's instruction. The conclave's response to our 311 pages was immediate and furious and entirely procedural. They contested every citation, dispute. The clause interpretation filed a counter notice asserting that the minimum protection standards did not apply to corrective actions under sovereign hegemonic law, and summoned the compact to a formal arbitration panel constituted under hegemonic authority. We declined the summons, politely in writing with citations. This, the notice, the response, the counter notice, the declined summons took approximately 3 months, and while it was happening, the world kept moving. The 5 independent species that had cited scheduling conflicts and resource concerns were now in direct bilateral talks with compact transit administrators. A 6th had reached out quietly through a neutral intermediary. The transit numbers for the quarter showed a 4-point shift in commercial routing away from hegemonic administered lanes, 4 points across the whole sector. Sounds modest. At the volumes the sector moved, 4 points was an enormous amount of freight. The conclave's economic monitoring section flagged the transit shift in an internal report that became public much later through the neutral station archive at Vorath. The report described the shift as within normal variance and recommended no immediate action. It noted that the shift correlated with the ongoing compact dispute, but characterized the relationship as likely coincidental given the modest scale. Modest scale, that phrase appears in 3 separate hegemonic internal documents from that quarter. I have read each one carefully, and I believe the analysts who wrote it were not being dishonest. They were reasoning from a model that had been accurate for 700 years, which told them that a 4-point transit shift was noise, not signal. Their model did not have a variable for what the early stages of a deliberate structural transition looked like when conducted by a party with complete alternative infrastructure. Their model had never needed that variable before. There was a word used in hegemonic diplomatic circles for what we were doing. I heard it from a hegemonic secondary delegate who defected to the neutral station at Vorath 8 months into this dispute and gave a recorded interview in which she described the atmosphere inside the conclave. The word, translated roughly as the posture of those who have already decided, the connotation was negative. It described a party that was unwilling to engage in the proper work of negotiation, but she used it without the negative connotation. She said they had already decided the whole apparatus of hegemonic authority could not find a lever that worked on people who had already decided. She described one particular session, an intercom committee meeting, not the full conclave attended only by the 8 most senior hegemonic administrative directors, in which the transit data for the previous 6 months was presented. Aggregate. One of the directors had asked the economic analyst presenting the data to describe in plain terms what a continued 12-month trend at the current rate would mean for hegemonic administrative revenue. The analyst had described it. The director had asked him to run the projection again using the rate from the previous 3 months rather than the full 6, since the trend had been accelerating. The analyst had run it again. The room had been quiet for a long time. Then one of the directors had asked, when did they build this? The answer was over the previous 4 years. In public reports, in plain language, the room had gotten quieter. The answer was their infrastructure, which the Kongs claim concert voyeuring section had now found in the public infrastructure reports 4 years too late. The scale of it when they mapped it caused a session recess of 2 full days. I know this because the session record when published showed a 2-day gap with the notation administrative recess, and the defecting delegate confirmed in her interview that the recess was not administrative. She described the presiding elder, not the mouth of accumulated grievance, who had retired by then, but his successor, an elder of the VTH corn species, whose title translated as the keeper of the settled question, setting down his session notes, looking at the mapping projection, and saying nothing for a very long time. Then he had asked how long the infrastructure had been under development. When told 4 years, he had asked why no one had flagged it. He was told it had been in the public infrastructure reports. He was told the language had described it as sovereign infrastructure development. He had said, in the hegemonic tongue, we did not ask. And then the recess, I want to describe the second year, because the second year was when the scale the secretary had promised me became visible in the numbers in a way that the first year, for all its momentum, had not been. In the first year we were building. In the second year we were running something that was running itself. The CN's administrative infrastructure had enough agreements and enough routing diversity and enough parties whose daily logistic depended on it that it had acquired the quality that all infrastructure eventually acquires when it is mature enough. It worked without anyone needing to push it. That quality was the exact thing the hegemonic conclave had possessed for 7 centuries and was now by increments losing 13%. That was the overall transit shift by the end of the second year. In absolute terms, the number was staggering: more freight, more species, more bilateral agreements than the entire first year's output combined. The conclave's economic analysts had revised their projections twice. After the second revision, the 8 senior administrative directors convened again in the same inner committee format as the meeting the defected delegate had described. This time, she told me, the transit analyst was not asked to run the projection twice. He ran at it once, and then the presiding elder of the inner committee, the keeper of the settled question, dismissed the analyst and sat with his 7 colleagues in silence for a considerable time. What broke the silence was not the presiding elder. It was one of the other directors, a senior member from the conclave's legal section, who said in a tone described by the defecting delegate as carefully controlled, if we issue a third notice, what does the compact file in response? No one answered immediately. After a moment, the presiding elder said, more citations, another silence, and the species who did not attend the emergency session said a third director, do we expect them to attend the next convening? The answer was no one knew. That was the honest answer. The conclave's intelligence section had been attempting to model the attendance trajectory and had produced a range of outcomes, none of which the senior directors found acceptable for the straightforward reason that every scenario in the range showed further decline. The keeper of the settled question looked at the transit projection on the display in front of him for a long time. Then he looked at the attendance modeling. Then he set both aside. He said, locate the legal instrument that can compel them back. The legal section spent 3 months looking. They did not find one because we had closed every door they might have used carefully in the 311 pages and the subsequent exchanges, each response anticipating the next argument and addressing it in advance. The conclave's legal section was skilled. The problem was not their skill. The problem was that the compact's legal team had been working the problem for 4 years and the conclave's team had started 2 months ago. The strategic planning section had named the contingency 7. It had been drafted 2 years before the KTH Summit approved, funded, and placed in a sealed operational file that required the simultaneous authorization of the Secretary of Compact Affairs and the Compact Senior Strategic Planning Director to open when Petra made her call from the Summit housing compound on the 3rd day after Davin's death. Those 2 people were already in the same room. They opened the file together. Contingency 7 did not involve a declaration of war. It did not involve a military ultimatum. It involved trade, transit, legal architecture, and time. Coordinated, patient, methodical transfer of the economic and logistical relationships that the hegemonic order depended on for its coherence, conducted one agreement at a time through the parallel infrastructure with every independent species that the hegemonic order depended on to sustain its framework. It was in essence the removal of load-bearing elements from a structure, conducted carefully enough that the structure did not immediately collapse, just incrementally became unable to support its own weight. I spent the following 3 years inside that work, and I want to be accurate about what it was, because the formal record is sometimes read as though it were a campaign, a coordinated aggressive action with clear command structure and decisive moments. It was not that. It was more like carpentry, careful, detail-heavy, unspectacular, requiring the kind of patience that is not dramatic but that cannot be replaced by anything more glamorous. The work happened in meeting rooms on neutral stations, in long technical sessions with delegations from species who were weighing costs and alternatives and precedents, in document exchanges that went through 12 revisions before both parties accepted a single clause. The 4th station facility was where most of the work accumulated. I was stationed there for much of the 2nd and 3rd year after Karth, running the record-keeping office that tracked every agreement made, every transit route shifted, every administrative relationship that changed hands. The station was not impressive to Look at a mid-sized transit node with functional architecture and no particular historical significance. Expanded considerably during the infrastructure build-out, but still essentially a working facility, the duds. The galaxy's actual business, while the grand chambers elsewhere hold their sessions. The work at Vorith was not glamorous and it was not swift. I want to record that because the formal history has a tendency to describe what we did in terms that make it sound decisive and clean, a strategic dismantling, a coordinated campaign. From inside it, it was neither of those things. It was careful negotiation, conducted at the pace of trust. Every species that came to us came with questions, and the questions were honest. Questions asked by people who had been operating inside the hegemonic order for a long time and who understood that changing infrastructure was not simple, and that the consequences of doing it badly were real. We did not tell them the transition was risk-free. We told them what the risks were in as much detail as they wanted, and we answered their follow-up questions, and we gave them time to sit with the answers. Some of them took a long time. That was correct. We waited. One meeting at Vorith stays with me specifically because it was the meeting that made the numbers change in a way that felt definitive rather than incremental. Sarith Collective, a four-system commercial confederation that had been one of the hegemonic conclave's most reliable mid-tier client bodies for over a century, sent a senior trade delegation 11 months after KATH, nominally to discuss transit route adjustments, but actually, as everyone in the room understood, to have a conversation about what the next 5 years were going to look like. The Sarith delegation was led by a woman named Tessa Varin, and she sat across the table from me and 3 of my colleagues for 6 hours, and she asked questions that were careful, specific, and honest. She wanted to know the structure of the mutual protection covenant we were developing. She wanted to know the dispute resolution process in detail, specifically whether any single party had override authority, and if so, under what conditions. She wanted to understand how the Stacy's administrative governance worked, who had votes, how those votes were weighted. She did not ask about the Kareth incident directly. It was present in the room with us as surely as anything else, but she did not name it. And I did not name it either, because what she was actually asking was whether what we were building was going to be different in the way that mattered. She had been operating inside the hegemonic order for 20 years. She understood what a framework that had no override protection looked like from the inside. I answered every question as precisely as I could. I showed her the governance documents, the draft covenant, the route maps, the transit pricing structure. I showed her the audit protocols. I did not oversell, did not minimize the genuine difficulties of transition, did not claim the new framework was without risk. It had risks, and she knew it had risks, and the useful thing was to describe them accurately. Somewhere in the 4th hour, she asked me something I had not been asked before. She said, "What is the dispute resolution process if one of the larger parties, the compact itself, acts against the interests of a smaller member?" I told her in detail how the covenant handled exactly that scenario, the independent arbitration panel, the composition rules that prevented any single species from having more than one representative, the binding nature of the panel's findings. On all signatories, including the compact, she wrote something in her own ledger, then she looked up and said, without any particular emphasis, the conclave had a provision like that once. In the original accords, it was removed. In the third generation of amendments. I know, I said. She nodded slowly. That's what I needed to hear, she said. Not agreement, not warmth, just the acknowledgement that I had known the history and hadn't tried to talk around it. At the end of 6 hours, she leaned back and said, the conclave held our transit licensing for 112 years. We never negotiated those terms. They were given to us. I know, I said. This process takes 3 months approximately, depending on the complexity of the corridor mapping. She looked at the documents on the table, then at me. We'll need to run it by our full council. Give us 30 days. Of course. She gathered her materials, stood and extended her hand, a gesture from our culture, not hers, which told me she had been doing her homework. I stood and took it. The Sarth Collective signed their transit agreement 28 days later. When I entered it in the record, I noted Sarth Collective Transit agreement signed 112 years in the hegemonic framework, 28 days to exit. The numbers that followed over the next 6 months were similar, not identical. Some transitions took longer, some required additional negotiating session, some required us to revisit provisions and adjust them, but the trajectory was consistent. The CCN's administrative capacity was running at 60% utilization at the start of the second year. By the end of it, we were at 92% and adding coordination staff. The conclave understood what was happening before the end of the first year. They issued a second formal notice of obligation. We responded with another 300 pages of documented citations. They convened an emergency session and passed a resolution to declaring the compact in material breach of the framework accords. We published a 40-page response, noting that the resolution had been passed without a quorum of full member species because 7 member species had declined to attend, citing scheduling conflicts. I was present when our Secretary of Compact Affairs received the transcript of that emergency session and the quorum count. He read the quorum count twice, set the document down and said 7. I said, yes. He said a year ago it would have been 2, maybe 3. The infrastructure roots help. I said, when the alternative exists, the calculus changes. He was quiet for a moment. Dean Mers was from KTH station originally. Did you know that? I had not known that. No, I knew his father slightly years ago, before the boy was born. He went to the window outside the administrative city, moved in its ordinary rhythms, transit, lanes, towers, the ordinary business of a civilization conducting itself. His father would have been built by all this. He said he was a quiet man, builder. He didn't like large mechanisms. He paused. I think the boy probably took after him. I didn't say anything. The large mechanism is going to come apart, he said. You understand that? Not in a year, maybe not in 5, but it is going to come apart because the architecture that holds it together depends on all the parties needing it, and we are systematically removing the need. When enough parties stop needing it, the ones who remain can't hold the weight. What replaces it? He turned from the window. That's the next job, and it's going to be harder than this one. He picked up the session transcript, held it for a moment, and then set it in The document disposal, make sure the record is complete, everything documented, the 47th day, the legal exchange, the infrastructure timeline, the quorum count, everything, for what purpose? So that when the species who come after us ask how this happened, the answer is available. They'll want to understand how a 700-year order came apart. They deserve an accurate account. In the third year, the deterioration became visible in ways that did not require analysis. The conclave's presiding elder changed twice in 18 months. The keeper of the settled question stepped down, citing health. Successor was appointed from the inner committee, and that successor lasted 4 months before a procedural dispute among the remaining full-member species produced a governance crisis that the conclave's own constitutional structure was not equipped to resolve cleanly. They resolved it eventually by a narrow vote among the diminished membership. The resulting presiding elder was a competent administrator from a species I had dealt with in several transit negotiations, and I had no particular animus toward him, but by the time he took the position was nominal. There was not enough left to preside over for the title to mean what it had meant. The senior hegemonic worlds that had formed the conclave's institutional core attempted in that third year to negotiate a reduced framework among themselves. Preservation of the conclave's core agreements, even as the broader membership eroded. The effort was genuine, and the diplomats involved were skilled. What they could not solve was the mathematics of it, the reduced framework operating without the transit volumes and administrative revenues that the departed members had provided could not sustain the infrastructure that made it functional. The hegemonic routing network required a minimum number of active nodes and a minimum volume of commercial traffic to operate at viable cost. As the network shrank, the cost per transaction increased. As the cost increased, the remaining parties had stronger economic incentives to move their freight through cheaper routes. Our routes, the conclave did not announce a dissolution. There was no ceremony, no document, no single moment. The session simply became less frequent and then infrequent, and then the scheduling of the next session was postponed, and the postponement extended, and at some point the extension was indefinite, and everyone understood what that meant, and the administrative staff filed the outstanding records, closed the open accounts, and sent the final documentation to the neutral station archive at Vorith, because the archive at Vorith was the most complete public record of what had happened, and it seemed like the correct place for the final documentation to rest. I want to be careful here about what I am saying and what I am not saying, because this account is the formal record and precision matters. I'm not saying that humanity won the dispute through superior virtue, or that the hegemonic conclave deserved its fate as a simple matter of cosmic justice. I am saying that the conclave's strategic model was built on a set of assumptions about the parties it dealt with, and those assumptions had been formed over 7 centuries of dealing with species that needed the hegemonic order more than the order needed them. The conclave had mapped the edges of what those species would endure and made the map their operating reality. They had tried to map us the same way. There is a secondary observation I want to make here, because it belongs in the record. The conclave's error was not arrogance in the simple Sense, not the arrogance of incompetence or ignorance, it was something more specific and in some ways harder to avoid. They had a model that had worked without exception for 7 centuries. 7 centuries is a long time. It is long enough that the model stops feeling like a model and starts feeling like the nature of things. When your model has no failures, you stop testing it, you stop asking whether it applies to the new case in front of you, because it has always applied to every case before. The mouth of accumulated grievance had applied it to us with complete procedural correctness, every step called in the proper form, the amber columns at proper height, the legal citation accurate. He had applied a tool that had worked for 700 years. The possibility that the tool would not work this time, that this party had already completed the work of leaving before the tool was applied, was not something his model could accommodate, because his model had never required that accommodation. I do not hold him in contempt for this. I find it clarifying. An authority structure that has never encountered a genuine outside is not equipped to recognize one. The hegemonic conclave had been the outside for every species it ever dealt with. It had never been on the inside, looking out at something it could not control, because there had never been an outside to look out at. We built them one. That was what the 4 years of parallel infrastructure represented in its simplest form, not an aggressive act, not a challenge to their authority, the completion of an exit that was not coerced, not theatrical, and not dependent on their cooperation or their understanding. When Petra placed that document on the table and walked out, she was walking through a door that already existed into a road that was already paved toward a structure that was already standing. The conclave spent the following 2 years trying to understand how that was possible. The answer was that we had been building in the open the whole time, and they had not looked, because in 700 years nothing had ever required them to look at what we were building. They had tried at the KTH summit with Davin Merce to locate the edge of what we would absorb. They thought the lesson would be received. They thought we would return to the table with a corrected understanding of the relationship. What they had actually done was answer a question that our strategic planning section had been holding for 4 years. Is there a version of this relationship in which the hegemonic order deals with us as equals? The answer given in 11 minutes on the 47th day was unambiguous. The contingency had been there waiting, because Petravale was not the only person in the compact who prepared for outcomes she hoped would not occur. The parallel infrastructure had been built in public, in plain language, by people who understood that you do not prepare a contingency by hiding it, you prepare it by completing it. The conclave had not asked what sovereign infrastructure development meant. They had not needed to ask, because in 700 years no party had ever built anything that made the answer matter. That oversight cost them everything they had built. The formal dissolution of the hegemonic conclave did not come in a single dramatic moment, no fleet engagement, no signing ceremony, no public declaration. It came the way structures under sustained load eventually come apart. A component gave, then another, then the accommodation of each failure put more weight on what remained, until the weight was more than the remaining components could support. The conclave held its final full session 18 months after the KTH incident, and Even calling it a full session is generous. 14 of its 42-member species sent delegations. The session record is 4 pages long. The final entry reads, "No further business was proposed. Session is adjourned pending scheduling." Of the next convening, there was no next convening. I was not at the final session. I was at Vorth Station in a working meeting with 3 delegations from independent species whose transit relationships had shifted to our network, going through the technical parameters of a mutual aid provision. When a colleague found me in the corridor afterward and told me what the session record said, I stood there for a moment. She asked if I was all right. I said I was. I went back to my office and opened the formal record. I added the date, added a brief notation, conclave final. Session record, 4 pages, no quorum. No next convening. Then I closed the document and sat there. I had been expecting this moment for over a year. Not expecting it the way you expect something you want, expecting it the way you expect an outcome that the data has been pointing to for long enough that the arrival is confirmation rather than surprise. I had looked at the quorum numbers, the transit figures, the membership attrition, the governance difficulties of that 3rd year, and I had known where it was going. Knowing where something is going does not prepare you for the moment it arrives. The moment has a weight that the projection doesn't. 700 years. Hegemonic conclave had been the organizing structure of this region of the galaxy for 700 years. It had administered hundreds of treaties, adjudicated thousands of disputes, maintained the transit infrastructure. That species had grown there. Civilizations around, whatever its failures, and this record has been thorough about those failures. It had been real and it was gone, and I sat in my office at Vorth Station on a routine working day and felt the absence of it. The way you feel the absence of something that was always in the background that you took for granted, precisely because it was always there. I thought about the 47th day, about Davin crossing the floor, about the gavel. Then I got up, washed my face, and went back to the work, the corridor outside. My office window showed the ordinary movement of a working transit node. Personnel in compact livery, personnel in several other species formal dress, cargo handlers, administrative clerks, maintenance team replacing a ceiling fixture. A woman at a table across the corridor was writing in a bound ledger. Not a data slate, a ledger, and I watched her for a moment, the way her pen moved, the deliberate pace of it. And I thought about what it meant to be selective about what you record. I have thought often about the 47th day, the administrative officer's aide coming to our table, David crossing the floor as he had been asked to cross it, as any professional does when asked to perform the basic function of their role. The gavel, the 11 minutes. Petra still watching every second, her expression not flinching, her hands flat on the table because she knew the transmission arrays were running, and she understood that the record was the record, the document already folded in her case. I have thought about what the conclave thought they were doing. They believed genuinely that the corrective action was legal, appropriate, and communicative. They believed they were establishing the terms of the relationship, showing a younger civilization the weight and precedence of hegemonic law, the way senior structures demonstrate authority to junior ones. They believed the lesson would be received, they understood. Hierarchy, they had operated one for 7 centuries, what they did not understand, what it had never been necessary for them to understand, was a party for whom hierarchy, however large and ancient, was simply not the governing fact. Petrovale had not walked out of that chamber because she was outraged. She was not performing outrage, not signaling moral injury, not positioning for a negotiation she intended to resume. She walked out because the relationship the conclave had just defined was not a relationship the compact was going to maintain. That was all. The document on the table was not a threat, it was a notification. Distinction mattered and still matters. The hegemonic conclave failed because it had spent 7 centuries in a position where its primary tool of relationship management was the calibration of tolerance, learning for each party. It dealt with precisely how much discomfort that party would accept before compliance. This tool had worked without exception for the entire history of the conclave's operation because every party it had dealt with had a cost they could not afford. The tool worked because the alternative was worse than compliance. They had not encountered a party that had built the alternative before they applied the tool. They had not asked because no one had ever made asking necessary. I sometimes think about what the conclave might have done differently, not in the sense of revising what happened. This record is not an argument for what could have been, it is an account of what was, but because an honest record of a failure should include what success might have looked like. The answer, as best I can determine it, is asked what we were building in those 4 years of public infrastructure reports, asked whether the parallel framework was complete enough to be functional, asked at the KATH summit in the 11 months before the 47th day what our departure posture was and whether we had prepared for it. The answers would have been available. We were not concealing them. The infrastructure reports were filed with the hegemonic commercial registry. Anyone who read them carefully would have seen what they described. No one read them carefully because 700 years of never needing to had made careful reading feel unnecessary. That is the whole of the structural failure. It is not dramatic. It does not require malice or stupidity. It requires only the specific blindness that comes from never having had a reason to look. Dave Merce did not make it necessary. He died before he could make anything necessary. What he did through no intention of his own was provide an answer to a question the compact strategic planners had been holding for 4 years. Is the hegemonic order something we can work within, or is it something we need to work around? The 47th day answered that question. Contingency 7 was already waiting. I do not know what the mouth of accumulated grievance understood in the moment after. He set the gavel down and looked at Petrovale and found her looking back at him without expression and without apology. I do not know what he expected to see in her face and did not find. I know only what I saw from my position at the table, a woman who had already done what needed to be done, sitting in a chair waiting for a process to conclude so she could stand up. I do not know whether the conclave's individual members in the years after the dissolution understood what had happened to them. Some of the member species adapted the bilateral agreements that replaced the hegemonic framework were in many cases more favorable to them than the conclave's terms had been, and a few of them had been waiting quietly for a framework that did not require them to operate as clients of a 7-century-old authority structure. Some struggled. The transition period produced genuine hardship in parts of the galaxy that had been integrated into hegemonic logistics for so long that the infrastructure adjustment was genuinely disruptive, and I do not minimize that. We staffed a transition support program for 18 months. We tried to do it correctly. I think we largely did. The record reflects the effort. Davin Mers did not die for a cause. He was 18 years old, doing his job, crossing a floor he had been sent across. He was not a martyr, and I will not call him one, because to call him a martyr would be to assign his death a purpose it did not have and did not deserve. He was a young officer with a bound ledger and a letter from his mother playing in the morning, and the particular gift noted in his supervisor's file for understanding what actually mattered. He was going to be extraordinary, and he was not given the chance to be. That is the whole and complete fact of what happened to him. Everything else is the consequence of what the conclave chose to do that day. The dissolution of the hegemonic conclave did not give him his life back. There is no ledger that balances that way. What it did was ensure that what was done to him could not be done again inside that particular order to the next 18-year-old in the next delegation, because the order no longer existed to do it. That is not justice. It is a structural correction applied at a scale proportionate to the offense. Conclave had used the phrase right of necessary correction for what they did to him. I have found that phrase difficult to set aside. The new framework does not have a right of necessary correction. It has an extensive dispute resolution process, mutual protection covenant that 46 independent species have now signed, and a transit infrastructure more equitable and more efficient than what it replaced in the administrative wing of the Sovereign Transit and Commerce Network Central Coordination Facility, large, somewhat austere building on the neutral station at KTH in the same star system as the settled world where Devin Mers was born. There is a wall, bare stone, undecorated, facing the main corridor, where the SD Tons administrative staff pass every day. On the wall there is a single plaque set at eye level with a short inscription. The inscription reads, "This framework was not built for the powerful. It was built by those who had already decided." Beneath it, a name: Davin Mers, Courier, 47th day of the KTH Summit, 18 years old. I was present when the plaque was installed. Petrovale was there, and the Secretary of Compact Affairs and several of the delegation members who had been at KTH. We did not make a ceremony of it. The installation team finished, confirmed the mounting, and left. We stood in the corridor for a few minutes, not speaking, looking at it. The corridor was otherwise empty at that hour. Somewhere further down the station, the ordinary work of the new framework was proceeding. Meetings running, documents being filed, agreements being built, one careful clause at a time, in rooms just like the rooms we had used at KTH, except that the architecture they were building did not contain a right of necessary correction, and never would. Petra was the first to leave. She said nothing. She had her ledger under her arm, and she walked down the corridor the way she walked everywhere, purposeful, contained, carrying whatever she carried without making it visible, and turned a corner and was gone. The secretary stood For a moment longer, he read the inscription twice, the way he had read documents his entire career, as if the second reading might tell him something the first had withheld. Then he said, quietly to no one in particular, his father was a builder. He adjusted his coat, which did not need adjusting, and walked away. I was the last to leave, as I had been the last through the chamber doors at Carth. I stood in the corridor and looked at the name on the wall for a while, long enough to be sure I had it in my memory correctly, the way you want certain things in your memory correctly. Not because you are likely to forget them, but because precision matters, and the name of a person deserves the same precision you would give any other fact in a formal record. Then I took out my own ledger. I had picked up the habit somewhere in the 3 years of record keeping, found it helped me think, and I wrote one line in it. I closed the ledger and walked back to the work. Record is complete.